The wind howled across the endless prairie like the wails of forgotten souls, carrying with it the scent of dust and decay. In the heart of this desolate frontier stood a barn that time had forgotten, its weathered boards gray as tombstones, its doors sealed tight against the world. For 3 long years, no living soul had dared approach its rotting frame. The townsfolk whispered of curses and ghosts, crossing themselves when they passed by on the distant road. But on this particular storm-lashed night, as lightning split the sky like God's own judgment, a lone figure on horseback moved through the darkness. The Loner Cowman, as the locals called him, was a man carved from the same hard stone as the mountains that bordered their territory. At 43, his face bore the deep lines of a life lived under an unforgiving sun, and his eyes held secrets that even the prairie wind couldn't steal away. His name was Samuel Cross, though few knew it and fewer still dared speak it. He'd been riding these lands for nigh on 20 years, keeping to himself, tending his small herd, and asking nothing of anyone. The town of Millfield treated him like a ghost, present but unseen, tolerated but never welcomed. There were whispers about his past, fragments of stories about a man who had once worn a different kind of badge, who had seen things in the war that changed him forever. Samuel had come west after the conflict ended, carrying wounds that went deeper than flesh. He'd lost everything that mattered: his family, his home, his faith in humanity itself. The prairie had become his sanctuary, a place where a man could disappear into the vastness and forget the ghosts that haunted his dreams. As Samuel guided his horse through the driving rain, something caught his eye. There, seeping through a crack in the barn's eastern wall, was the faintest glimmer of light. Not the cold gleam of moonlight or the harsh flash of lightning, but something warm and trembling, like the last breath of a dying candle. He reined in his horse, squinting through the storm. The light flickered once, twice, then vanished. Samuel sat motionless for a long moment, rain streaming from the brim of his hat. Every instinct told him to ride on, to mind his own business as he always had. But something deeper, something he'd thought long dead, stirred in his chest. The same instinct that had once made him a good lawman, before the world taught him that justice was often just another word for vengeance. The storm raged for another hour before finally exhausting itself against the indifferent prairie. Samuel made camp in a grove of cottonwoods a mile from the barn, but sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that trembling light, and with it came memories he'd spent years trying to bury, memories of another woman, another time, when he'd failed to act and paid the price in blood and sorrow. Dawn broke gray and reluctant over the prairie, painting the world in shades of ash and bone. Samuel had spent the night in restless sleep, haunted by visions of that trembling light and the ghosts of his past. As the first rays of sun pierced the morning mist, he saddled his horse and rode back to the barn, driven by a compulsion he couldn't name but couldn't ignore. In daylight, the structure looked even more forbidding. The wood was black with rot in places, and weeds grew tall around its foundation. A heavy chain and padlock secured the main doors, rusty but still strong. Samuel dismounted and walked the perimeter, searching for the source of the light he'd seen. The building was larger than it had appeared in the storm, with a hayloft and what looked like living quarters attached to one side. On the eastern wall, he found it, a gap between 2 boards, no wider than his thumb. Kneeling, he peered through the crack. The interior was lost in shadow, but there was something there, a shape that didn't belong to the geometry of an empty barn. As his eyes adjusted, he could make out what looked like a makeshift shelter in the far corner, constructed from old horse blankets and scraps of wood. "Hello?" he called softly. "Is someone in there?" Silence answered him, but it was the kind of silence that held its breath, waiting. Samuel pressed his ear to the crack and listened. There, so faint he almost missed it, the sound of breathing, quick and shallow, like a frightened animal. Samuel returned to his horse and retrieved a crowbar from his saddlebags. The nails in the barn door were old and brittle, and they gave way with sharp cracks that echoed across the prairie like gunshots. As the door swung open on protesting hinges, a shaft of sunlight pierced the darkness within, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the stale air. What Samuel saw made his blood run cold. In the far corner, huddled on a pile of moldy straw, was a young woman. She was little more than skin and bones, her dress hanging in tatters, her hair matted and wild. But it was her eyes that struck him most, wide and luminous, filled with a terror so profound it seemed to have carved itself into her very soul. They were the eyes of someone who had seen the worst of humanity and somehow survived. She didn't speak, didn't move, just stared at him with those haunted eyes. In her skeletal fist, she clutched something, a piece of paper, crumpled and stained with what looked like tears and blood. "Sweet Jesus," Samuel whispered, stepping into the barn. "How long have you been here?" The woman flinched at his voice but made no sound. Samuel approached slowly as he would a wounded animal, his hands visible and empty. The smell hit him then, the stench of human waste and decay, of a life reduced to mere survival. How had she lived like this? How had no one known? "I'm not going to hurt you," he said gently. "My name's Samuel. I'm here to help." When he knelt beside her, she pressed herself against the wall, but she didn't let go of the paper. Samuel could see now that she was young, maybe 25, but her ordeal had aged her beyond her years. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her skin pale as moonlight. Around her wrist was a crude shackle, attached to a chain that had been bolted to the barn's foundation. "Water," he said, more to himself than to her. "You need water." He returned to his horse and brought back his canteen. The woman's eyes followed his every movement, but when he offered her the water, she drank greedily, as if she hadn't tasted clean water in months. Some of it spilled down her chin, and she tried to catch every drop with her hands. As she drank, Samuel noticed something else: scratches on the barn walls. Hundreds of them, marking days like a prisoner's calendar. 3 years' worth of days, carved with fingernails and desperation. Near the scratches, someone had carved words into the wood. "God help me. Remember my name. Elizabeth Hartwell." "Elizabeth," Samuel said softly, and the woman's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. "That's your name, isn't it? Elizabeth Hartwell." For the first time she nodded, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. "Who did this to you?" he asked, but the woman only stared at him with those terrible, knowing eyes. It was then that she slowly uncurled her fist, revealing the crumpled paper. With trembling fingers, she held it out to him. Samuel took it carefully, smoothing out the creases. Written in a shaky hand were just 4 words: "Trust no one else." The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Samuel look up sharply. Through the open barn door, he could see a group of riders approaching. 5 men led by Sheriff Marcus Donovan, a man whose badge carried more weight than his conscience. Donovan was a big man, thick around the middle, with small eyes that missed nothing and a smile that never reached them. "Well, well," Donovan called out as he dismounted. "Samuel Cross, as I live and breathe. Heard you were poking around where you don't belong." Samuel stood slowly, positioning himself between the sheriff and the woman. "Found someone who needs help, Sheriff. Been locked in here for years by the look of it." Donovan's eyes narrowed as he peered into the barn. When he saw the woman, his face went pale, then flushed red with anger. "That there's town business, Cross. Nothing for a drifter like you to concern himself with." "Town business?" Samuel's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Keeping a woman prisoner is town business? You don't understand the situation," Donovan said, his hand resting on his gun. "This woman is dangerous, mentally unstable. We've been looking for her for years." Samuel glanced back at the woman, who had shrunk further into the shadows at the sight of the sheriff. The terror in her eyes had deepened, and she was shaking her head frantically, mouthing the word "no" over and over. "If she's so dangerous," Samuel said slowly, "why wasn't she in a proper facility? Why locked in a barn like an animal?" "That's not your concern," Donovan snapped. "Now step aside. We'll take her where she belongs." But Samuel didn't move. Something in the woman's eyes, in the way she recoiled from the sheriff, told him everything he needed to know. "I don't think so, Sheriff. I think this lady and I need to have a conversation with Judge Morrison." The tension in the air grew thick as molasses. Donovan's men shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward their weapons. But Samuel Cross had faced down worse odds in his time, and his reputation with a gun was well known, even if his past was not. "You're making a mistake, Cross," Donovan said quietly. "A big one. This town has ways of dealing with troublemakers." "Is that a threat, Sheriff?" "It's a promise." But before the situation could escalate further, another voice cut through the morning air. "What's all this commotion about?" Judge Morrison himself rode up, flanked by 2 of his own men. At 65, Morrison was one of the few honest officials left in Millfield, and his presence changed the dynamic immediately. He was a tall, lean man with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that had seen enough of frontier justice to know the difference between law and lawlessness. "Judge," Donovan said, forcing a smile. "Just collecting a fugitive. Nothing to concern yourself with." Morrison dismounted and walked into the barn, his keen eyes taking in the scene, the scratches on the walls, the woman's condition, the fear in her eyes, the chain around her ankle. When he emerged, his face was grim as a thundercloud. "Sheriff Donovan," he said formally, "I'm placing this woman under the protection of the court pending a full investigation. Mr. Cross, I'm deputizing you temporarily to ensure her safety." Donovan's face went purple with rage. "You can't do that. This is my jurisdiction, and this is my courtroom." Morrison replied coldly, "Any objections can be filed through proper channels." As the sheriff and his men rode away, their threats hanging in the air like smoke, Samuel helped the woman to her feet. She was weak, barely able to stand, but there was something in her eyes now, a flicker of hope that hadn't been there before. "What's your name?" Morrison asked gently, though Samuel had already told him. The woman opened her mouth, and for the first time in 3 years, she spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, rusty from disuse, but her words were clear. "Elizabeth. Elizabeth Hartwell." The name hit Samuel like a physical blow. Hartwell, he knew that name. It belonged to one of the most powerful families in the territory, landowners who controlled vast stretches of the prairie and had their fingers in every profitable venture for 100 miles. "Hartwell," Morrison repeated, his face grave. "As in Thomas Hartwell?" Elizabeth nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. My father." The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place with sickening clarity. Thomas Hartwell was not just wealthy, he was ruthless. A man who would stop at nothing to protect his interests and his reputation. If his own daughter had been locked away for 3 years, there had to be a reason that went far beyond simple family disputes. Over the next several days, as Elizabeth slowly regained her strength under the care of Doc Patterson and his wife, the truth began to emerge. It came in fragments at first, broken memories and whispered confessions that painted a picture of corruption and cruelty that ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Doc Patterson was a kind man in his 50s, one of the few people in Millfield who had always treated Samuel with respect. His wife Sarah was a former nurse who had seen her share of human suffering. Together they worked tirelessly to restore Elizabeth's health, both physical and mental. Elizabeth had discovered something 3 years ago, something that threatened to destroy not just her father's empire, but the entire power structure of Millfield. She had stumbled upon evidence of a systematic scheme to defraud homesteaders of their land, using forged documents and intimidation tactics that sometimes escalated to murder. The scheme was elaborate and far-reaching. Homesteaders would file claims on good land, work it for months or years, then suddenly find themselves facing legal challenges to their ownership. Documents would disappear from the land office, or new papers would surface claiming prior ownership. Those who fought back often found their crops destroyed, their livestock killed, or worse. But the conspiracy went even deeper than land fraud. Elizabeth revealed the existence of a secret network, a group of women who had banded together to protect others from the violence and oppression that plagued the frontier. They called themselves the Prairie Sisters, and they had been working in secret for years, helping abused women escape, providing safe passage for those fleeing dangerous situations, and documenting the crimes of powerful men who thought themselves above the law. Elizabeth had been one of them, using her position in her father's house to gather evidence and pass information to the network. She had access to her father's correspondence, his business records, his private meetings. For months, she had been copying documents and passing them to the Prairie Sisters, building a case that would expose the entire conspiracy. But she had gotten too close to the truth, and her father had discovered her activities. "He couldn't kill me," she told Samuel one evening as they sat on the porch of Doc Patterson's house. "I was his daughter, and even he had limits, but he couldn't let me expose him either. So he found a middle ground, a living death." Samuel's hands clenched into fists, and Sheriff Donovan was part of it. Donovan, Mayor Caldwell, half the town council, they all had their hands in the till. My father made sure of that. Easier to control men when you own their secrets. The conspiracy had tentacles that reached into every aspect of life in Millfield. The bank president was involved, approving loans to homesteaders knowing they would soon lose their land. The land office clerk was paid to lose or alter documents. Even the local newspaper editor was bought and paid for, ensuring that stories of missing homesteaders or suspicious deaths never saw print. As Elizabeth's story spread through the town, battle lines were drawn. Judge Morrison worked tirelessly to gather evidence and build a case, but the conspiracy fought back with every weapon at their disposal. Witnesses disappeared in the night. Documents went missing, and Samuel found himself marked for death by men who had everything to lose. The first attempt on his life came on a moonless night as he rode back from checking on his cattle. 3 men with rifles, hidden in the rocks above Devil's Canyon. Samuel's horse took a bullet in the shoulder, throwing him from the saddle just as another shot split the air where his head had been. He rolled behind a boulder as bullets sparked off the stone around him. These weren't random bandits. They moved with military precision, coordinating their fire to keep him pinned down. Samuel counted their shots, waiting for the moment when they would have to reload. When it came, he moved like lightning, his Colt .45 speaking its deadly language. 2 of the assassins fell before they could chamber fresh rounds. The third tried to run, but didn't make it 50 yards before Samuel's bullet found him. As Samuel searched the bodies, he found what he expected. Money, more than any cowhand could earn in a year, and a note with simple instructions. Kill Cross. Make it look like an accident. The war was escalating, and Samuel knew it was only a matter of time before they came for Elizabeth again. He moved her to a safe house on the outskirts of town, a small cabin owned by a member of the Prairie Sisters, an elderly woman named Martha Crenshaw, who had been fighting the good fight longer than anyone. Martha was a remarkable woman, a widow who had lost her husband to claim jumpers 20 years earlier. She had spent the decades since building the Prairie Sisters into a formidable network, helping dozens of women escape abusive situations and documenting crimes that the law refused to investigate. It was Martha who revealed the final piece of the puzzle, the secret that made Elizabeth's imprisonment not just a crime but a tragedy of epic proportions. She was pregnant, Martha said quietly as they sat around the cabin's small table. When they locked her away, she was carrying a child. Samuel felt the world tilt around him. What happened to the baby? Elizabeth's face crumpled, and for the first time since he'd found her, she broke down completely. Through her tears, she told them the rest of the story, how she had given birth alone in that barn, how the child had lived for only 3 days before succumbing to the cold and her own malnourishment, how she had buried the tiny body with her own hands in the corner of the barn. That's what the light was, she whispered. I made a small memorial, lit a candle every night for 3 years. It was all I had left of him. The father of the child, she revealed, had been a young lawyer named David Morrison, Judge Morrison's own son, who had been killed in what everyone believed was a riding accident shortly after Elizabeth's disappearance. Now they knew the truth. David had been murdered because he had been helping Elizabeth gather evidence against her father. The rage that filled Samuel in that moment was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It burned through him like wildfire, consuming every rational thought except one. Thomas Hartwell and his conspirators would pay for what they had done, but revenge would have to wait. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Judge Morrison had been found dead in his study, apparently the victim of a heart attack. With him gone, the investigation ground to a halt, and Sheriff Donovan moved quickly to reassert his authority. It's over, Elizabeth said when she heard the news. Without Morrison, we have no protection. They'll come for us now. But Samuel had other ideas. That night, he rode into Millfield alone, his guns loaded and his mind made up. If the law wouldn't deliver justice, he would do it himself. The Hartwell mansion sat on a hill overlooking the town, a monument to wealth built on the bones of the innocent. Samuel approached it like a ghost, using skills learned in darker days to slip past the guards and into the house itself. He found Thomas Hartwell in his study, a man in his 60s with silver hair and cold eyes, counting money by lamplight. When Hartwell looked up and saw Samuel standing in the doorway, he didn't seem surprised. Samuel Cross, he said calmly. I've been expecting you. Have you now? Oh yes. You're quite the romantic hero, aren't you? Riding to the rescue of the damsel in distress. Very touching. Samuel stepped into the room, his hand resting on his gun. Your daughter told me what you did. All of it. Hartwell laughed, a sound like breaking glass. My daughter is a delusional woman who couldn't accept her place in the world. I gave her everything, wealth, position, a future, and she threw it all away for some misguided notion of justice. You locked her in a barn for 3 years, Let her baby die. For the first time, Hartwell's composure cracked. That child was a bastard, the product of her liaison with some drifter. It would have ruined everything I built. Samuel's gun was in his hand before Hartwell could blink. You're going to confess. Write it all down. Every crime, every murder, every life you destroyed. Or what? You'll kill me? Hartwell smiled coldly. Go ahead. Pull that trigger. But know this. If I die, Elizabeth dies too. I have men watching her right now, waiting for my signal. It was a standoff that could have lasted forever, but it was broken by the sound of approaching horses. Through the window, Samuel could see riders surrounding the house, not Hartwell's men, but women, dozens of them, armed and determined. The Prairie sisters had come to finish what Elizabeth had started. Martha Crenshaw